Hi, science class. I'm not sure if I'm going to be feeling well enough to come in tomorrow, so I wanted to make a screencast of our next set of notes, which is on asexual reproduction. So yesterday you took notes on sexual reproduction and saw that when organisms reproduce, they combine genetic information from two different parents during sexual reproduction. Now we're going to look at a different type of reproduction, which is asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is the production of offspring by one parent. So there's only one parent involved. It results in offspring that are genetically identical to the parent organisms. The offsprings are almost like clones of the parent. So basically, the difference between this and sexual reproduction is one, you only need one parent for asexual reproduction. And then rather than having genetic variation and differences with the offspring, all of the offspring are exactly identical to the parent. There are three different types of asexual reproduction that we'll talk about. One is binary fission, two is fragmentation, and budding. So the first type is called binary fission. Actually sounds like a very smart science word. Binary fission is when one cell divides into two cells, and these two cells are going to be genetically identical to the original cell. This occurs in bacteria, in most prokaryotes, so simple single-celled organisms. And the two genetically identical daughter cells are produced very, very rapidly. So it happens super fast. So if you look at this picture, you'll see this is a bacteria cell, and it's showing that DNA on the inside of that bacteria cell. And that DNA is going to make a copy of itself. So it's going to copy those chromosomes. And then those two copies are going to split apart. And then those two daughter cells are going to be genetically identical to that original parent cell. If you remember when we talked about cell division with how the body gets from one cell to many, so we gave that penny allowance example and how one goes to two and then two goes to four and they keep doubling. So this is kind of like very similar. So this is a type of asexual reproduction. All right, fragmentation. So if you look at that word, you might see a different word in there that will help you remember what this type of reproduction is. So if you saw the word fragment, that is what I wanted you to see. So the parent organism breaks into fragments or different parts, and each fragment will generate a new organism. So new animals or plants are produced from pieces of the parent organism. So you probably have seen examples of this before. One is with plant cutting. So there are certain types of plants that you can cut a piece off and then you can plant that into the ground or stick it in a jar of water and it will regrow roots. And then you can grow a new plant. And that new plant is going to be genetically identical to that parent organism. So I've done this quite often. There are certain types of even vegetables, like green onions. You can cut off the tops of the green onions, stick the roots into water, and they'll grow brand new green onions. I used to live, when I was younger, our next door neighbor had this ice plant called candy apple that was just grew really fast, and it was green and it was nice. And I remember my parents wanted to get some of that, and he was like, oh, well, why don't you just cut some pieces of my ice plant off and then just plant it into the ground and then it will grow. So that's what we did. So we went and we cut little pieces of his ice plant off, and then we planted it into our ground, and then we had a bunch of new ice plant as well that was genetically identical to obviously the other ice plant that we cut it from. So plants, definitely fragmentation is very common. Another really cool example of fragmentation is with sea stars. So this is actually a sea star. It's a starfish. Okay, and if you see here, there's like one giant leg, and then there's these little legs right here. So what happened is the adult sea star's arm broke off. So this is the adult sea star arm, broke off, and then from that arm, all of these little new arms developed. So now we have a brand new sea star that came from that original parent organism. Pretty cool, huh? All right, the third type of asexual reproduction is budding. So budding is when a new organism forms on the parent organism. Okay, this new organism called a bud eventually separates from the parent. So one example is yeast. So you can see here, here's some yeast cells, and that yeast, which we use for baking bread, will form these little buds on it, and then these little buds will break off and become their own organism. Hydra, which is a tiny freshwater anemone-like animal, does the same thing. So if you look at this hydra right here, it's forming a little bud. Okay, those little buds are going to fall off, and then they're going to become new organisms. There's actually a, I don't know if anyone's seen the SpongeBob episode where SpongeBob has all of these little sponges like sprouting off of him, and they pop off and they become new little SpongeBobs. Well, that's actually a science example of budding, because sponges actually can also reproduce through budding. All right, so those are the three main types of natural asexual reproduction. Now, there's also something called cloning, which is a method of asexual reproduction developed by scientists and performed in laboratories. So cloning produces identical individuals from DNA taken from a multicellular organism. There's a brain plop on cloning that you can watch after these notes. So scientists have used cloning techniques with plants to create identical plants. But I'm going to show you this example. So Dolly the sheep in 1996 was a very famous sheep. It was the first animal to be successfully cloned. But it's not like probably what you think. Like in your mind, you might have this vision of the sheep goes into like this laboratory, and then there's like bzz, zapping lights, and all of a sudden there's an identical sheep. It's not like that at all. So they actually need 3 sheep to clone this one sheep. So what they do is, if you can see in this picture, it's really complicated. So they, from sheep X, they're going to grab some cells from sheep X, and then from sheep Y, they're going to grab an unfertilized egg, but they're going to take that DNA out of that egg, and they're going to put the DNA from sheep X into that unfertilized egg of sheep Y. Okay, so now we have that unfertilized egg with the DNA from the first sheep. Then that cell is going to develop into an embryo. So this is the zygote stage. And then that embryo will then grow into, that embryo is then implanted into sheep Z. So then now they're going to implant that embryo into sheep Z, so the third sheep that's going to be pregnant with this embryo, and then it's going to give birth to Dolly, the new cloned sheep that is going to be genetically identical to sheep X over here. Super complicated. You don't need to know this, but in case you're wondering how cloning works, that is how it works. You just need to know that it is not natural and it is performed in laboratories. Okay, so basically the advantages of asexual reproduction are the opposite of the disadvantages of sexual reproduction. So one advantage is that no time or energy is expended finding a mate. They don't need a mate, so they can just reproduce when they want to. Another advantage is it takes less time to produce offspring, so they can reproduce very quickly, so it can happen rapidly. For example, with binary fission, we just have cells dividing and dividing and dividing. So those are the two main advantages. One of the disadvantages of asexual reproduction is that there is a lack of genetic variation. This lack of genetic variation is a big disadvantage. So even though it's only one disadvantage, it's a big disadvantage. This lacking genetic variation may make that species not able to survive if there's some sort of change in the environment or a disease comes along that they're not resistant to. Okay. All right. I had some review of the sexual reproduction. I don't want to confuse you with asexual reproduction, so I'm going to skip through these. Okay, these were some advantages, disadvantages of sexual reproduction. Okay, so, the answer's already in here. But here's just a quick review. So what type of asexual reproduction involves reproduction by cell division only? So that would be fission. Okay, what type of asexual reproduction involves new organisms forming on parent organisms? That would be budding. What type of asexual reproduction involves producing a new animal from pieces of an animal's body? Okay, that would be fragmentation. And then what is the term for asexual reproduction performed by scientists in a laboratory? And that would be cloning. All right, so I think I changed on your note sheet on the back. There's a learning reflection with 3 different questions to answer. But if I did not, I'll have you define these 5 terms in your 5-sentence summary. But I think I changed it and there's only 3 questions to answer. So go ahead and do that. All right, those are your notes for today. Thank you.